Good morning, everybody. This is going to be, hopefully, a very interactive session because you've already had quite a bit of time now to settle in. So what I want you to do is make sure you have a pen and paper ready to start getting your questions down. We have a really fantastic panel who are going to give us a very brief input in relation to the area of how to sustain the sector's role in the delivery of public services. Ivan has touched on a few of the tensions in that area, and for those of you who are in the audience who are either playing a role directly in relation to that, this isn't going to be an area that you don't have plenty to say about, but I particularly want you to hear the panel's input and come back to them in relation to maybe questions and inputs. So, I'm going to briefly introduce each of the panel members, and then I'm going to just hand over to them to do their input, and then as soon as they're all finished, we will do the Q&A session. So is that okay? So our first speaker is going to be Suzanne Connolly, probably very well known to many people here as the CEO of Barnardos. She was formerly the Director of Children's Services there, a role she held for more than 17 years. She led the transformation of Barnardos Children's Services to become a needs-led and outcome-focused with clear organisational commitment to the evaluation of their work. Suzanne is a qualified social worker. She's 7 years experience working as a social worker and 9 years experience in management in the UK and Ireland, providing a range of family support services in the voluntary sector. So I'm going to hand over to Suzanne.
So is this on? Yes, you can hear me. First of all, it's great to be here talking to you. It's funny when we start talking about length of time that we've been in organisations, and I'm going to be 22 years in Barnardos in September, so it's a long time. And it's interesting talking to this issue in terms of the role of the community and voluntary sector, which, I mean, I feel really passionately about, and I'm sure all of you do here. I just think it's essential to an effective society, and I think what the country needs is what I would call a mixed economy, always of service provision, that no one sector should have a monopoly. And I think that's the least that we can do for the children, families, older people, whoever it is that we serve. And one of the things that I think is really important in that context is that services that the state commissions to be provided are properly funded. And that includes governance costs, because we know we also are very accountable in terms of ensuring that we spend money effectively. And I always want to stress that both the state and our sector are accountable to the public. We share that equally, as we share an equal commitment to quality services. And for me, partnership is about proper funding. I actually don't think you can talk about values in principles in a real way if that isn't accompanied by a proper recognition of what it costs to deliver services. Otherwise, and this is a very strong word to use, otherwise it becomes exploitative. And the staff who do give their lives to this work become drained, they can become stressed, they can actually feel underappreciated. And the problem with that is that then ultimately can affect the quality of service provision. And one of the things I was saying actually when we were talking at the table is the really importance of the different sectors understanding each other's perspective. But one of the things I think that's really hard for people who've always worked in the state, be that in the civil service or in state provision of services, of which I was one, by the way, is they can never really understand the stress of underfunding. So you can see I'm a bit stressing what I think is key, but actually I really do think it's key. And I think that what I would like to be really saying to the politicians, to the civil servants, to be deeper, to the Department of Finance, this is our money. It's not your money, it's our money. So let's be fair and equitable in terms of how we share that in order to meet our equal passion to ensuring that people who need our services get them. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Suzanne. Now we're going to hand over for a very different perspective, coming from the business side. We have Dr. Karen McGann, who's the Head of Social Policy at IBEC, Ireland's largest business representative body. She is the chair of the Joint Equality Council at the ISB, board member of the Governing Authority DCU, member of the External Group of Experts at the European Consortium of Innovative Universities, and a member of the Labour Market Advisory Council. Prior to joining IBEC in 2008, Cara held roles in industry as a career development manager, organisational psychologist, and a lecturer. Cara.
Thanks very much, Inez, and good morning, everybody. It's really lovely to be able to join you this morning for what looks like a really, really interesting day. I suppose, as Inez says, from the business perspective, the last number of years has been very much transformative. If you think from the lows of the financial crisis back in 2008 to the last couple of years as a pandemic, we've seen a spectacular recovery in the economy. We now have 2.57 million people in employment. Our unemployment levels are at 3.9%, which is the lowest it's been in the last 20 years. And that's a really good position to be in as an economy. But that 2.57 million in employment, of that, there's only about 300,000 of those in the public sector, which is about the same as when we had the financial crash. So we haven't kept pace, despite the scale of the private sector increasing. And that makes Ireland one of the lowest in terms in the OECD in terms of the ratio of public to private sector workers. And that impacts our daily lives. So that impacts how people go about trying to find somewhere to live. It impacts how they access larger classroom sizes, trying to get affordable, accessible childcare, elder care and long-term care options, hospital beds, and so on. And the community and voluntary sector has bridged that gap more and more over the years, under huge pressure to deliver really key services, whether that be in care, in health, in education, in employment services, disability services, as Ivan said, and others. So this is a really serious situation for us. If we go back to the 20th century, business typically located themselves where there were natural resources and really good transport links, and skilled workers tend to flock to those areas. But today, with the more intangible global economy, we find ourselves with businesses locating themselves where they believe skilled workers will be located. And those skilled workers want to live where they can get a reasonable salary, but an internationally competitive quality of life. So the lack of public infrastructure and services that are well funded and delivered means that it's not only impacting our personal quality of life, but it's actually impacting Ireland's national competitiveness. And if we look to the UK over the last number of years, what we've seen is that they too have gone through a huge population explosion, the largest in their generation, and they haven't been able to cope with it because their infrastructure hasn't been able to keep pace. It's grown too big, so people are finding themselves crowded out of their GP surgeries. They're finding that the NHS is almost falling over. And this is something that had led to maybe a social movement as a result of that, which in part led to Brexit. So Ireland's infrastructure isn't fit for purpose for the scale of the population that we have. And what that means is that we're seeing a real change in how we look at things going forward. We've found that now we have a public sector that has become, in some areas, proportionately too small for the size of our population. So that means that, we're seeing difficulty with, if we need more regulation, we need more planners. If we need more security, we need more Gardaí and Defence Forces. In health, we need more medics and nurses. In education, we need more teachers. And all of that is because we have this disproportionate scale. And the community and voluntary sector has extremely ably delivered in a really meaningful and a really tangible way at local and community levels, but often without reasonable support, without reasonable funding, and often without an overarching strategy. And we know if the community and voluntary services were put on the open market, they would come at significant cost to the state, an overwhelming cost to the state. And yet we see that the community and voluntary sector is continuing to deliver sort of despite the lack of, that lack of supports, rather than, as a result of them. But what it does mean is that your reach is constrained. It means that maybe your delivery isn't consistent nationally. And so then we get into a geographic lottery for services. So I think post-pandemic, we're finding ourselves in a position where there is a renewed urgency on how do we go forward to actually tackle the challenges that are facing Ireland today. But these challenges are too big for any of us to individually, in our silos, if you like, tackle. We need a new social dialogue. We need a consensus. We need a collective to come together to be able to tackle these particular challenges as a community. We need to have long-term ring-fence, structured funding and supports that are there so that people can plan, that people know that there's security in that planning, and that it's not, an undercurrent stopping you from doing what you're already doing really well. And I think in that way, we can see a really vibrant civil society that continues to and maybe can grow in its delivery, in its contribution to Ireland as a broader, more participative, more inclusive, accountable Ireland. I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you. Our next contributor is Pauline McKeown. Again, somebody who will be very well known to people in the audience. She's the Chief Executive of Coolmine Therapeutic Community. Coolmine is a national drug and alcohol treatment centre providing evidence-based community and residential services. Pauline has over 25 years' experience of working in social care settings, namely homelessness, the alcohol and drug treatment services, both in the UK and Ireland. She joined Coolmine in 2004 and has held several management positions during this time. She is currently a member of the Department of Health's National Oversight Committee for the current National Drug and Alcohol Strategy, Chair of the National Voluntary Drug and Alcohol Sector Steering Committee, and Board Member of the European Federation of Therapeutic Communities and Simon Communities Ireland. Pauline.
Thank you, Inez, for that great introduction. It's just a real privilege to be here this morning for us to come together in person and to look at the public services provided by the community and voluntary sector. Last week, my organisation celebrated our 50th year of providing services here in Ireland. We were the first residential treatment centre established in 1973. And I guess what we know from those 50 years is three core things. Firstly, treatment and rehabilitation to people from social deprivation backgrounds, when available, can work and does work. We know that because we conducted a longitudinal outcome study of our work. And that showed us that 7 out of 10 were illicit drug-free 2 years following treatment. The second thing we know is that a continuum of care is just to sustain recovery. So we need to ensure we're looking at housing, we need to ensure we're looking at education and employment pathways for the clients that we work with, because that's what sustains recovery. And the third thing is access. Because if you can't access the services, you can't start that journey. And so thinking about today and coming forward and speaking in the panel, it's very much about the people that we work with. And that is people who are very marginalised in Irish society, traveller community members, homeless people, people from within the criminal justice system who don't get the opportunity to access the health services. What I can tell you is that addiction services, homeless services across the voluntary and community sector, we're at a critical point. And we're at a critical point because what's been raised, full costs to deliver our services, is not in place. And secondly, pay parity is not in place, and we are bleeding staff. In terms of demand, we see an 11% increase in problem drug and alcohol use across Irish society. We're seeing prevalence of cocaine use in every village and every community across Ireland. And we're also seeing a sustained prevalence around opiate use. But in this post-COVID era that we're in, we're seeing high levels of mental health needs amongst the clients that we're working with, and in particular the women. Our services are dotted both in urban and in rural Ireland, in the southwest across Cork, Kerry, in the Midwest and in the East region. Something we provide is a residential treatment service for women and children. And I guess that is the critical piece, because in doing that, we are able to break generational cycles of addiction. But there's only 36 places available in Ireland for women, pregnant women, homeless women. Today, we know from this increase in demand for addiction and homeless services, we're not meeting that current demand. We're underfunded to meet that current demand, and we are concerned about the future. We have a really, really, really important national conversation currently underway in Ireland, the Citizens' Assembly on Drugs. And I think, not to preempt the recommendations from that report, we're certainly veering towards a health-led approach and the need to implement further health services and divert away from the criminal justice system. That's the role for the community and voluntary sector then again. For us, I think the issue around pay parity across the national voluntary drug and alcohol sector, right now today, our staff turnover rate is 34%. So 34% of our staff have left in the last 12 months. Right now, today, we have 19% of our total workforce. The roles are in a recruitment phase. So it's very difficult to sustain and to continue to deliver the full quantum of services. We have varying responses. We're funded by the HSE for community health care areas. Each one takes a different approach to the management fee applied for us to conclude and ensure and attend to the compliance and the governance arrangements in our organisations, and ultimately to safeguard the service delivery to the people for whom we serve. And the management fees in historical contracts are 0. The management fees in the newer contracts are 5% ranging upwards. But still, cumulatively, we're underfunded to ensure that. The inflation pressures and costs have increased, and I think whilst we welcomed the inflation payment last year, it's not recurring, and there was a specific statement that it shouldn't be used to support any staff funding. So I guess the impact for us, and I'll finish, we are in crisis and we can't sustain a 34% turnover in staff. We need critical investment. There's a current cost per unit study underway by the HSE to look at the cost of the residential treatment beds. The last one was 2017, and what that told us was that a residential treatment bed cost 13,000 for a male, 22,000 for a female. A staffed prison placement is over 85,000. So we need to consider where we're investing funds into the future. I think we have a history of not supporting vulnerable people, unfortunately, in Irish society, and I think we can't allow history to repeat itself. And for us, we'd be calling for pay parity and indeed full cost delivery for our services. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. And our final speaker is Pat Rabbitte. He has served as a public representative for 30 years, a former Irish Labour Party politician. He was the Minister for Communications, Energy and Natural Resources from 2011 to 2014, Leader of the Labour Party 2002-2007, and Minister for State at Commerce, Science and Technology from 1994 to 1997. In 1993, he was the chairperson of Dublin County Council. He's currently a member of the Economic and Social Research Institutes Council, and he is currently the chairperson of Tusla, taking up his tenure in that appointment in January 2019. Pat.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. This is such a broad subject that one could speak from many aspects on it, but I just want to make 2 simple points, neither of them original and both of them well understood by the audience here. The first one is that the character of our society is dictated by the quality of our public services. Quality, efficiency, effectiveness, accessibility, and so on. And of course, the need, I needn't tell this audience, is huge. And I'm not sure that all policy makers or leader writers understand how broad is the demand for different aspects of public services. The second point I want to make concerns the model of delivery. And in my conviction, the best model for delivery is a partnership between the state agencies and the community and voluntary sector. I was trying to remember there what product, the ad on television, is it electric toothbrushes? The brushes that will reach parts that other toothbrushes can't reach. Well, that's my experience of the community and voluntary sector, that the voluntary sector can reach areas that the statutory sector find sometimes very difficult to do. And I think that partnership is critical. And listening to my colleague from Coolmine, I'm reminded of when that was very forcibly brought home to me when I was chairman of the Cabinet subcommittee that produced the first report on the drugs epidemic. And it had been allowed to take root, and once that addiction problem takes root, it's virtually impossible. It's impossible to eradicate it. But it became clear to us on the subcommittee that the state agencies functioning in silos, often with disputes and turf wars, or ignoring each other, just weren't getting on top of the issue. So that the essence at the heart of the National Drug Strategy in 1996 was a partnership between the voluntary sector and the Department of Health, Justice, so on, so forth. And I think it functioned extremely well and had an awful lot of serious achievements. Whether it was always funded along the way as it ought to have been is another question. But if we are agreed then that this is the best model, the question arises, how do we treat the people in the voluntary sector, community sector, charities and all the rest who provide this essential service? And I can say as chair of Tusla that the very difficult challenge that we have could not be met without the work being done by so many agencies that we fund or part fund. It just wouldn't be possible. I mean, the Tusla, as you know, was established in January of 2014. It had a rocky enough start. There's a great deal of naivety, which is the kindest word I can use about some of the criticism, because, you know, there is this simplistic expectation that because we now have a standalone child protection agency, that, you know, everything will automatically fall into place. It isn't like that. It's not an agency whose good work every week will ever find reportage anywhere, but lapses will get dramatic coverage. But the contribution to our remit and to the general fabric of the social services by the voluntary sector is critical, and it has not been recognized in terms of remuneration. The cuts that everybody suffered after the financial crash have uniquely, in the main, not been restored to people in the community and voluntary sector. Now, Tusla does not have a remit to fix pay levels or make pay increases. Yes, we do fund the agencies. Yes, we did give, under the sustainability heading, a 4% increase last year. But if we're not permitted to fix pay levels, there is no restriction on us acting as advocate for the community and voluntary sector on this issue. And I can tell you I have raised this many times with the Minister for Children, with other ministers, put it in writing to the then Minister for Finance, and raised it with DEEPR. And it simply is not acceptable, nor is it fair that people providing these services in a range of disparate areas should be the only segment of workers that have been passed over for appropriate reparation. I now hope that the fact that the WRC is seized of this issue, that it will bring forward proposals that are acceptable and that will be implemented by government, because there's a responsibility on government here to respond to the issues that have been left in abeyance because of buck passing between ministers. I mean, I get all these responses, well, it's not my responsibility, and my civil servants are advising me it's not my responsibility. I get letter back saying, I've referred your letter to the Minister for Health, or I've forwarded your letter to the Minister for Children, and back and forward it goes, and it really isn't acceptable. And you know, it seems to me that the Minister for Public Expenditure now will have to make a decision in terms of fair treatment of the workers in the community and voluntary sector. I better stop, Chairperson. Had I?
I say you have about 2 minutes left.
All right. Well, we distribute about 200 million per annum to the organisations that we're in partnership with or that we're engaged with. And I don't accept, you know, the criticism of our child protection and welfare rights, and we have a wider remit than that. You know, that is the usual simplistic reportage. We've made tremendous progress in the last 20 years in terms of how we care for children in this society. And I think it's fair to say that in terms of a social network or safety net, the successive Irish governments have provided a fair safety net for people who are employed, trapped in poverty, all of the rest. We can argue about the quantum, but I think, you know, that disposition, the political disposition of all governments has been positive. But there are deficits, and, you know, it's possible to identify those deficits for a time when we happily do now have access to resources that weren't there before. And it seems to me that I don't want to tell the people here their business or how they should do their business. But because you are so disparate, because you are so geographically dispersed, you know, government is not obliged to respond to you in the fashion that ought to be. You know, if a trade union goes in to a single employment that had the number of people that are employed in the community and voluntary sector in one space, there would be progress. But you're far more difficult to organise. I suspect that organising some of you is like minding mice at a crossroads. I'd say it's pretty difficult to get you to view through one prism. But if you're going to make progress in terms of your own welfare, then it seems to me that you're obliged to do that, to combine. It's not my job to organise for the trade unions or whatever, but I would recommend that you take those steps. Thank you.